Before this video begins, I'd like to say a few things. First, there will be numbers in the bottom left hand of the screen. These are footnotes, so check the description for all the sources I'm using. Second, do check the description for the sources I'm using. There's fascinating material in there that goes far more in-depth than this video will be. Alright, that's everything. On to the video. History is a constant process, that of revising and re-acknowledging our past. The way we view this past has a large sway in what we understand, be it the good or the bad. Some ways are monuments to the past, celebrating history in explicitly public ways. Yet these monuments have been under controversy recently, especially those to Confederate generals across the United States. These monuments celebrate a racist, nationalistic view of the past that washes away the sins of the Confederacy in order to propagate a distorted view of one of America's darkest moments. But these Confederate monuments aren't the only monuments born out of nationalism. The Living History Museum, Colonial Williamsburg, was born out of this same nationalistic intent. Yet Colonial Williamsburg is viewed today as a great way to be introduced to the American past. Both Confederate monuments and Colonial Williamsburg were born of the same ideas, yet one has managed to stay positive in the public eye to the present day. To understand this seeming contradiction, one has to look into both the history of Colonial Williamsburg and Confederate monuments, with this video examining Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. Only then can we understand how these monuments evolve, the ways the public has viewed them, and why fully understanding the past is crucial for modern-day monuments to history. Museums almost always change over time. Be it new information being uncovered to society progressing, these hubs of knowledge frequently have to adapt to retain the importance they have. Colonial Williamsburg is no different. With such a large difference between the modern living museum and its original vision, it can be difficult to call them the same museum. Despite Colonial Williamsburg being a recreation of the original Williamsburg, founded in 1699, you don't need to know much about Williamsburg itself to understand Colonial Williamsburg. Just know that Williamsburg was established in 1699, was the capital of Virginia at one point, played roles in the Revolutionary War, and had a long history with slavery. Our story begins in the early 1900s with one man, W.A.R. Goodwin. Even in the late 1800s, Williamsburg was considered an old city. Ghost stories were an integral part, with claims of ghosts haunting the city, including a young French man haunting the Wythe House. As someone who has volunteered at the Wythe House for many hours, I have yet to see the ghost of a young French man waltzing around. These ghost stories reinforce the idea that Williamsburg was history. The city had kept the same look since the Civil War in Reconstruction and became an embodiment of the South. Then World War I happened, and Williamsburg was forced to quickly industrialize. Goodwin experienced this shift firsthand, having lived in Williamsburg for many years before the change, with this change pushing Goodwin towards preserving what history Williamsburg had left. Sounds like a noble goal, but Goodwin's motives corrupted this idealistic vision. Instead of recreating an accurate version of Williamsburg, he would instead shape it to be a museum dedicated to the ghosts of our past, not the enslaved or natives, but the Washingtons and Jeffersons that walked among the city. The restoration of Williamsburg was focused on buildings that held on to their colonial-era charm and their glad and gallant ghosts. Goodwin was not focusing on preserving history. Instead, he chose to preserve his vision of the town, that of the elite, powerful men walking the same roads he walked. The downtrodden and oppressed had no place in Goodwin's Williamsburg. Funding for the project was difficult, as the citizens of Williamsburg only had so much money, and Goodwin wasn't exactly rolling in the dough. His strategy was to take potential investors and show them Williamsburg from his eyes, showing the town as he envisioned it in order to recreate it as such. This enforces the notion that Colonial Williamsburg was not born out of a desire to accurately portray the American past, but instead out of a nationalistic endeavor crafted to entice wealthy tourists from around the United States, telling them that this is history. Goodwin's search for investors eventually bore fruit when he convinced John D. Rockefeller Jr. to support the project. With Rockefeller's involvement, Goodwin shifted focuses, instead painting the project as a site of academic excellence. Yet the notion of hauntings remained. You could take the ghosts out of the marketing, but you couldn't take the ghosts out of the city. As construction went on, the message sent to the public was that Colonial Williamsburg would bring you the past, an accurate portrayal of what life was like in Williamsburg during the American Revolution. In a historical report about the Governor's Palace, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation proudly boasted about the Governor's Palace, claiming that it saw the pageant of Virginia colonial life at its best, going into extreme detail of the luxury found at this building. Having been to the Governor's Palace, it is a truly impressive sight. But the focus of the palace was not to highlight the difference between the elite members of society to the poor citizens, but to romanticize the past. making it seem that the governor's palace was the norm. This notion that the American past was that of the elite would come to define Colonial Williamsburg in the first decades of its existence. Despite the apparent spectacle of having history brought to life, if you weren't interested in the colonial aesthetic, you were most likely going to end up bored out of your mind. In order to prevent tourists from growing bored, Colonial Williamsburg built a 40-acre information center close to the historical city. It included everything from bedrooms to classrooms, as well as twin theaters and air conditioning. To go with these new theaters, a film was produced, Williamsburg, the story of a patriot. Film was expanding across the United States, and the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation capitalized on it, producing a film set in historic Williamsburg, premiering in 1957. This movie helped establish the tone of Colonial Williamsburg, as guests would frequently view it before entering the museum itself. This movie is emblematic of the issues Colonial Williamsburg had and the nationalistic past it presented itself as. Our protagonist is one John Fry, a plantation owner heading out to Williamsburg to participate in the House of Burgesses. Already, the movie ventures into dangerous water, with a portrayal of slavery that does not come anywhere close to accurately portraying such a vile institution. The slaves are portrayed as happy workers, waving goodbye to Fry as he leaves for Williamsburg. Already, the movie is enticing visitors with a romanticized, nationalistic view of the past. And this doesn't stop here, as not even 9 minutes into the movie, Fry meets George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Patrick Henry. The movie solidifies the notion that you're coming to Colonial Williamsburg to meet these legends of American history, that these major figures are American history. Throughout the film, the British are portrayed as stuck-up tyrants, dissolving the House of Burgesses, taxing their goods, and, worst of all,
powder! They're stealing the powder! They're stealing the powder! They're stealing the powder!
while the Americans are plucky rebels fighting back, celebrating America as a nation of liberty. This is the epitome of the nationalism Colonial Williamsburg represented, with this film holding the record as the most screened film of all time, with it still being screened until the COVID-19 pandemic halted screenings. This focus on the great men of the past, the ghosts of Williamsburg, would last until the 1970s. This shift in focus came from the Foundation's Vice President for Interpretation, Edward P. Alexander. His goal was to adjust the focus of Colonial Williamsburg away from these ghosts and instead towards what life was actually like. As the bicentennial of the American Revolution grew closer, Alexander began pushing for a more participatory and sensual-minded interpretation of Colonial Williamsburg. He wanted guests to be fully immersed in the city on all levels, from the smell of gunpowder in the air after military drills to tasting whorehound drops in the odoriferous apothecary shop. Whatever that means. In 1977, arguably one of the biggest changes Colonial Williamsburg had ever made was the introduction of historical interpreters, dressing up in period-accurate costumes and guiding guests throughout the historical museum. These interpreters helped ground both guests and the museum in the past, beginning the shift away from larger-than-life ghosts haunting the city, and instead towards a more accurate portrayal of the past. Of course, figures like George Washington would still roam around the museum. The ghosts will linger, but their portrayal was rooted in reality instead of our imagination. Despite this shift away from the great men of history, the museum still had problems. The museum shied away from discussion of slavery, with attempts at portraying the slave trade being met with general outrage. Colonial Williamsburg was in a difficult position, as it had to balance an accurate portrayal of the past with public opinion. Hosting mock slave auctions, while historically accurate, is certainly not popular with the public. Ignoring the issue, on the other hand, may keep the museum out of some controversy, but it harms historical perception and echoes back to the nationalistic days of the museum's founding. Over time, the museum has made strides towards striking a balance, with buildings such as the Randolph House having a focus on slavery in Williamsburg. Despite Colonial Williamsburg's complicated past, the museum is constantly trying to present a more accurate depiction of the past. The full horrors of slavery are unlikely to be fully shown, but these efforts made to both represent and understand this crucial element of both Williamsburg and America as a whole show CW's efforts to distance themselves from their nationalistic past. The past does not change, but our understanding of it does, without which we would never know the full truth, stuck with ghosts of our own creation, haunting us for eons to come. When watching Williamsburg, the story of a patriot, one thing that caught my eye were the costumes. It's clear as day that the costume designers for this movie spent a lot of time trying to get the style right, and that sentiment goes for pretty much everything except the troublesome parts of history. Another movie that reminded me of was the lost cause trash that is Gods and Generals. Directed by Ron Maxwell, the movie attempts to portray the Civil War from the Confederate view, regurgitating so much lost cause propaganda you'd think it was from the 1940s. Despite being about vastly different time periods, both of these films encounter the same problems, though on wildly different scales. Nationalism was not only limited to the American Revolution, but the Civil War also spawned its fair share of nationalistic monuments, with one notable example being Monument Avenue. It's time to examine these statues and see where Monument Avenue failed, why it's rightly seen as a monument to an authoritarian, racist regime. Before we begin with Monument Avenue, let's cover some basics. First, the Confederate States of America unquestionably seceded from the Union over the issue of slavery. This started the American Civil War, which the Confederacy lost. But how does a Southerner at the time cope with the fact that the state they lived in seceded for such an evil cause? That's right, gaslighting. In the South, it was widely accepted that the Confederacy fought for a noble cause, that the North was tyrannical and it was all about states' rights or taxes or something. This was the birth of the Lost Cause movement, the notion that the Confederacy fought for a lost cause, in order to distance the South and its people from the horrors the Confederacy fought for. In order to understand Monument Avenue and Confederate monuments as a whole, you have to understand their mindset in the decades following the Civil War. The choice of Richmond for the location of Monument Avenue was no coincidence. Richmond was the former capital of the Confederacy and was heavily damaged during the war. The South as a whole was largely shattered with a crippled economy and an embarrassed populace, so where better to build a monument to the South's excellence? While the city was being rebuilt, one William C. Allen was making it big. As a contractor and developer, he profited off of rebuilding the city, leaving a sizable inheritance to his 4 children. In 1887, Otway Allen was in contact with the city's engineer, Collinson Pierpont Edwards Burgoyne, hell of a name, to create an extension of Franklin Street, with this extension eventually morphing into Monument Avenue. At the new intersection between Franklin Street and Allen Avenue was a circle dubbed Lee Place. Guess who it was named after? With the deed to the circle being given to the Lee Monument Association. Hopefully, you can see where this is going. The first statue on Monument Avenue was unveiled and dedicated on May 29, 1890, featuring Robert E. Lee on his horse overlooking the underdeveloped section of the city. This was the South's way of saying that they were right, without explicitly saying they were right, though they did that too. What Robert E. Lee stood for, Richmond stood for, Virginia stood for, the South stood for. They weren't finished with just Lee, as they dedicated more monuments to Confederate heroes, including Jeb Stuart on May 30th, 1907, Jefferson Davis 4 days later, Stonewall Jackson on October 11th, 1919, and Matthew Fontaine Maury on November 11th, 1929. This was not some isolated incident. These monuments were established across the South over many decades. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, over 2,000 Confederate monuments are still standing across the United States. These monuments almost universally supported the lost cause and notions that what the South fought for was worthy of respect, something to put pride in. Nationalism is at the core of the lost cause and Confederate monuments. From the unveiling of the Maury statue to the 1990s, these statues remained largely untouched. No new additions were made, but they remained as they were in the 1920s. That changed when on July 10, 1996, a statue to tennis legend Arthur Ashe was unveiled to the public. Ashe, the only black man to win Wimbledon, the US Open, and the Australian Open, was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia. Sadly, Ashe died from AIDS-related pneumonia at the age of 49, 3 years before the statue would be unveiled. The statue to Ashe was, predictably, controversial, both then and now. As my professor put it, it was like giving the Confederates a black friend to make them seem less racist. It was also controversial among supporters of the Confederacy, who claimed that Monument Avenue should remain a memorial solely to Confederate heroes. To some, the monument to Ashe was an affront to the dignity of their Confederate icons. To others, it put a legend like Ashe on the same level as traitorous losers. Overall, not a very good look for Monument Avenue. The 21st century spelled the end for Monument Avenue. After the white supremacist Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville left 1 dead and 19 injured, talk of removing Confederate monuments exploded across the United States. The mayor of Richmond, LeVar Stoney, stated that he would consider removing the famous street's Confederate statues. The monuments would not be taken down for another 3 years, with the monuments dedicated to Davis, Stuart, Jackson, and Maury being taken down in the summer of 2020, while the monument dedicated to Robert E. Lee would be taken down on September 8, 2021. 131 years after this monument was dedicated, it was finally taken down. Nationalism is a hell of a thing. The only monument left standing is the one dedicated to Arthur Ashe, which is beautifully ironic. I wonder if Lee is rolling in his grave right now. I sure hope he is. Looking back at both Colonial Williamsburg and Monument Avenue, it's easy to see the similarities. Both were born out of a nationalistic, romanticized view of the past that warps the actual history to a point it's almost unrecognizable. They take pride in claiming that they're the right history, backed up by biased sources and nationalistic fervor. Even the media made about them, both the story of a patriot and gods and generals, has some of the same flaws, sweeping under the rug the horrors of the past in order to present a clean, positive view of these groups. Yet, today we don't think of Colonial Williamsburg on the same level as Monument Avenue. Why? Adaptability. Monument Avenue remained as it was in the 1920s, a set of monuments dedicated to important figures in the Confederate States of America. The monument of Arthur Ashe has stood for over 20 years, but Monument Avenue's image hasn't changed. It was still the place with monuments to Confederate figures, but also with Arthur Ashe. Colonial Williamsburg, as a living museum, had the opportunity to adapt in order to survive. A museum is inherently more malleable than a statue, as you can introduce new ideas in order to shift the overall tone of the museum. The most you can do with a statue is give it a plaque with some context. Nationalism was what birthed both Monument Avenue and Colonial Williamsburg, but Colonial Williamsburg eventually shed this nationalism, encouraging learning of the sordid parts of our history. Monument Avenue didn't, and as a result has been left in the past, a relic of a bygone era. The past might not change, but our understanding of it does, fighting back against the nationalistic views of our ancestors. Confederate monuments will still exist, but museums like Colonial Williamsburg help show the reality of the past, of slavery, eroding the lost cause, one person at a time.